Hi, I'm Urvashi. I work on the interactive news desk at the New York Times, and today I'll be talking through the process of investigating New York City's privately owned public spaces that I followed while reporting a story that we published last July. I worked on this story in collaboration with Denise Liu and Keith Collins on the graphics desk at the Times, so it was one of those, visual, scrolly stories. If you haven't already read it. So I mentioned that we published the story last July, but I started working on the story the summer before that, so it took more than a year to put the story together. And when I think back on the kind of phases of working on the story, I can divide it up into exploring and finding these spaces, pitching and reporting the story and collecting the data that we needed to put everything together, and then arranging the material that we had in a way that would be visually compelling for our readers. So I found this story quite organically. I like to say that I physically stumbled into it. I was just walking through my neighborhood. I live on the Upper West Side, and I was near Lincoln Center, and I saw this passage in this building that led to this green space. And I was really curious, so I walked through that passage, and I found myself here. It was this beautiful green space, lots of flowers, lots of occupants. There was a bunch of seating, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to be there. I wasn't sure if this was a private garden meant for the tenants of the building next to it, or a public park meant for everybody. So I walked around the space a little bit more to try to figure out where I was, and I saw this sign on one of the walls. And the sign said that the plaza is open to the public, but it is owned and maintained by the building next to it. And when I got back home, I did some more Googling, and it turns out that this plaza is one of 598 privately owned public spaces, commonly referred to as POPs, that are spread out across 392 buildings in New York City. And these are the numbers from when we published, so there could be more now. But at the time of publication, this was the set of numbers we had. And as you can see in this great interactive map provided by the Department of City Planning, these spaces are most densely concentrated in Manhattan, particularly the Midtown and Financial District and Upper East Side neighborhoods, particularly areas where you see new construction. But they are spread out across all 5 boroughs. And the reason that these spaces exist is because of a trade that the city started offering developers in 1961. So the trade essentially lets developers trade in or exchange in a public plaza, either outside or inside their building, or it could be multiple public plazas, in exchange for bonus floor area to build with. This was put into place to kind of open up the city a little bit more. The city was seeing that with successful plazas like Seagram Plaza, people were really occupying this open space in front of buildings, and it kind of brought some more light and air into the city. And so that was the incentive behind introducing this zoning resolution in 1961. But as you can imagine, this is a super lucrative trade for developers because, rent and sales prices in New York are so high, and getting bonus floor area to build with is very valuable. So in exchange for building these spaces, since 1961, developers have received over 20 million square feet of bonus floor area that is worth approximately $10 billion. So after I found out about this trade and all of the spaces that there were, I'm a huge public space nerd. I love walking around and finding new spaces that I can hang out in. I just turned this into a kind of weekend project. I was like, I want to put these on my map and I want to find them and I want to have this kind of list in my pocket of spaces in the city that I can tell my friends about and spend time in if I find myself in that neighborhood. So I took that Department of City Planning map data and loaded it into my Google Maps. I found out that you can do this through Google My Maps. So it accepts like geographic data, and then you can layer it onto your Google Maps app, and then you can see your location relative to these spaces. You can also kind of color code and batch out and label these spaces depending on how you want to use it. So that's what I did here. I decided that every weekend I was going to visit a batch of these sites. I started off very ambitiously on the Upper East Side with all of these purple pins, and after I spent 6 hours walking around and taking pictures and documenting these spaces, I definitely scaled my ambitions down. So this is the final set of site visits I conducted in Midtown, very sparse. But again, you can see my little blue dot on this map, which was super helpful in like navigating myself around these spaces. And I also occasionally used Street View to see, what was I supposed to be seeing? Was I in the right place? So at the end of the summer, I ended up visiting more than 100 of these spaces. I quickly realized that I could not hit all 600 or 598. And I found some really beautiful public spaces. These ranged from just benches near a building in like a sunny and convenient spot to full-blown pocket parks with fountains and children's play areas. And these did what I think the 1961 law intended to do. But these really opened up the city. They brought light, air, more life onto the sidewalks. There were occupants, children playing, people throwing a ball around. And I've definitely, made a note of all of these spaces to come back to in the future. But what I also started increasingly seeing and became increasingly disillusioned by were closed spaces, spaces that were under construction, doormen that would come out and tell me that I wasn't allowed to be in a particular space because it was only for the residents of the building. And when I started noticing this trend, I went back home and I started this spreadsheet for myself. And I just created some basic columns here, whether the space was inhabitable, did it have signage, was it under construction, and did it have seating, greenery. Later I learned that a lot of these spaces aren't required to have seating or greenery or any amenities, but this was just kind of like a helpful initial tracker for myself to see what I was observing and to see if I could see it across my site visits. You can see at the bottom that all of these tabs are the different days which I conducted my site visits. And so after the summer, I wanted to do this story. I wanted to pitch it and I wanted to present it in a very visual way. So I think the first thing that people, at least this is how pitching works at times, but you're very encouraged to look through past coverage on an issue and see whether you are introducing anything new. And so I looked through past coverage of these spaces because I was sure that somebody had written about this problem before. And sure enough, basically ever since this law was created, people have been writing about these spaces. They have been in the news. But I think a couple of gaps that I found in past coverage that I felt like I could really fill were doing a very data-driven story. The comptroller's office did this report that was very data-driven. And so I wanted to kind of like do something like that, but in a news story. And then also just doing a very visual story. The Times graphics desk produces such amazing work, and I wanted to collaborate with them to kind of put together this on-the-ground perspective to make the reader feel like they were a pedestrian visiting one of these spaces and seeing what I saw. So the first thing I did was try to gather real life data to kind of ground my observations in real data sets. So first place I turned to, which is a very natural starting point, is the privately owned public spaces data set that is owned and maintained by the Department of City Planning. This was started in 2000 in a study that was done in collaboration with Gerald Caden, who is a professor at Harvard, and the Municipal Arts Society of New York. And this was actually in 2000, this kind of data gathering and very extensive review of these spaces was the first time that details of this trade were actually cataloged in a structured way. So before that, developers were creating these public plazas, they were getting the bonus floor area in exchange, but there wasn't like a very systematic cataloging of this. The first time that happened was in 2000, and the DCP has been doing it since. So this is where I turned to, and I noticed that this data set has everything from that 2000 study except for the details of the bonus floor area that developers are getting. That part is not available to the public. So I filed a Freedom of Information Law request to the Department of City Planning, and they got back to me with a bunch of PDFs with this information in a few months. And the PDFs look like this. So the data that I needed on the amount of bonus floor area that developers got was somewhere in here, but required a lot of kind of manual scanning and transferring over to a spreadsheet. And when I put together all the pages of the PDFs, I had over 2,000 PDF pages to go through and kind of transfer into a spreadsheet, which was definitely a process that I had to fact check at the end. And then the other part of this that I needed to ground in real data was the trend of violations that I was seeing. And so to do that, I first needed to understand what the enforcement process is for these sites. How does the city make sure that these spaces actually stay open to the public? So I created this very broad chart. This is based on information that I got from the Department of Buildings, who worked with me a lot during this story, and they were very, very helpful. So the way that the enforcement process starts is either through a scheduled inspection or a complaint from a member of the public, like you or me. Like we could go to one of these sites, see that something was wrong, and file a public complaint. Both of those lead to a Department of Buildings inspector showing up at that site and verifying that the problem is there. They can either find that there's no problem, or they find the problem and they issue a violation to the building owners. The building owners can either, when they get that violation, they can either admit that there is a problem and pay a penalty up front. The penalties usually range, they start at $5,000, go up to $25,000 for repeat and serial offenses. Or the building owners don't pay the penalty and the whole violation goes into a trial with a real judge. And the judge meets with building owner representatives and the Department of Buildings inspector, and they rule that the violation is dismissed based on lack of evidence, or building owners end up having to pay the penalty. So I started here. I started at the very beginning of this enforcement process, and I wanted to see whether the public complaints for these spaces matched up to what I was seeing. So there's this very comprehensive Department of Buildings complaints received data set that I pulled and downloaded. It has 2.8 million rows. There's a lot of complaints because these are complaints for across the board, like boiler complaints, all DOB complaints are encapsulated in this data set. But luckily, there is a column for complaint category and there is a category specifically for POPs complaints. So I could just filter by that one number and get all of the POPs complaints. And sure enough, the complaints that I was seeing matched up to what I saw when I visited these sites. For 3 weeks, there has been netting around the entire POP, so the public cannot enter the area. This winter, they took all the seating away, so it's just an empty courtyard. A security guard told me to leave the premises because I have children with me. So this was great. This was aligning with what I was seeing. But one of my editors told me that I need to be very careful while using complaints data. So complaints data is great if you're looking for, examples of a problem, which I was. But to actually, you have to be kind of wary of it because it could be that on the Upper East Side in one particular neighborhood, there are a bunch of people who love complaining, who are aware that these spaces exist, that they have to be open to the public. If they're not open to the public, they instantly go to the public complaints form and file a complaint. So that space on the Upper East Side is like blowing up and is receiving a ton of complaints. But then there's this other space downtown. Nobody knows about it. Nobody knows that you can even complain about it. Nobody knows that it's supposed to be open to the public. And that place, could be closed for years and years and could receive no complaints. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a problem there. So I next turned to the very final part of this enforcement process, which is the building owners acknowledge the problem and pay the penalty. And this is found in the DOB violations data set, which does not have a handy POPs filter. So I had to do some data munging here to filter it down to POPs violations. But I was able to get, a list of all confirmed penalties that were paid. So these were, cases that had gone through a trial with a real judge, or the building owners had admitted that they were guilty and had paid the penalty. So these were much more, closer to the source of truth than the complaints data set. And again, like the inspection notes corroborated what I was seeing. 100% of all amenities have been removed from plaza. Restaurant has privatized POPs by adding tables, chairs, and picnic benches. Metal spikes have been added to planter edges, presumably to stop people from sitting on them. So this is, I think, the end of our data collection. We had, one kind of broad stat here from the violations data set is that since 2011, over 50% of the buildings with these spaces have been issued a violation, which is actually a number that we ended up using in the story and featuring prominently because it's just such a large number. And so this is what the main database looked like after all of this. So there's a unique key, which is the building address, or more specifically the BIN, which is the building identification number. And then joined to that is the POPs data, so metadata about hours that it's required to be open, amenities that it's supposed to have, geographic data, and then the FOIL data, which was all the bonus floor area information and the trade information, complaints data, so I aggregated that to total complaints, and then violations data, how many violations was this building issued. So that was all of the collecting that took quite a few months, I would say 6 to 8 months. And the final part, which was fun but also daunting, was putting all of it together in the form of a story that we could present to our readers. So for those of you who haven't read the story, I'm just going to scroll through the opener really quickly to give you a sense of how we were thinking about putting everything together. So we start with this building in Midtown, and we show how much bonus floor area the developers got. And then we show the plaza that they gave the public in exchange, And we show the condition of the plaza over the years. There's construction debris here. The gates are closed. The gates are closed again. And I interviewed the architect of the plaza, Tom Bowlesley, and he said that he's just heartbroken every time he drives past this plaza because he designed it so carefully and it's historically been closed. So I'm just going to dissect the intro to show you how we put all of these pieces together and stitch this together. So we start with this bonus space highlight on the building. And I think doing this, showing exactly how much bonus space the developers got versus the actual plaza space is the easiest way to convey this trade to readers, to just show it on the building, show it on the ground. But putting together this one yellow highlight was a very long process because if you look at the building, the top floors are asymmetrical, which means that each of those top floors has a different floor area. And we had to calculate how many of those top floors were equivalent to 50,000 square feet, which was the bonus floor area that developers got. So we had to request floor plans from the Department of City Planning and the Department of Buildings and scale them and then figure out the cross-section of each floor on this plan and then calculate how many of them equated to 50,000 square feet. And then the second part of the intro was showing the conditions of the plaza. And for this part of the intro, we used Google Street View, which is one of my favorite tools now. If you don't know, you can click on that see latest date up there and then see like an archival view over the last 10 years of how a particular space looked. So you can see, going back to 2014, it even goes back further, images of this plaza. And so we first looked at the violation dates for this plaza and then tried to find images that aligned with those violation dates and also showed exactly what the inspection notes of that violation were saying. So for example, in 2016, the building was issued a violation for having construction debris. And so we found an image, a corresponding image from 2016 that showed that and put that in our intro. We have to be careful that we weren't doing the reverse, that we weren't using these images as examples of violations, but rather supplementing known violations with these images. Another graphic that we have in the story is this map. We felt like we had to have a map just to show the spread of these sites. But I think one other thing that the map really allowed us to do was highlight the violators versus non-violators, and really shows, you can see that gush of red over here and really get like an immediate sense of the problem here. And we layered on these inspection notes that I showed you earlier as annotations to the map to add some more color and also to show the spread of different types of violations. Another graphic we had was this public space versus building bonus space chart. This was to highlight specifically the trade that developers were making. So this is where we got the opportunity to use that FOIL data that the Department of City Planning provided for us, and also the violations data. So you can see that we're not only showing how much public space developers provided versus how much bonus space they received, but also layering the violations next to that to show that a lot of these spaces are also, repeat violators. And then the final set, the story ends with this kind of Google Street View before and after series to kind of put the reader back into the pedestrian's shoes and show them what the different types of violations are from the ground. So we see the first type of violation is reduced access. And so we see that the plaza on the left is completely open. There's lots of occupants. This is July 2019. In July 2021, it's totally fenced off. There's this giant green fence that is blocking access. And again, we had to find violations that the DOB issued for, we found a violation that said in 2021 there was a green fence in front of the plaza. And then we looked at Google Street View, found a picture from 2021 that had a green fence and used it in the after. This is an example of privatization or encroachment. So on the left, again, the plaza is open. It's 2013, a bunch of people in there. On the right, a restaurant nearby called Brooklyn Diner has flooded the plaza with their own tables and chairs and red umbrellas. And they received a violation for it in 2021. And actually, I went back there 2 weeks before the story was published just to see whether it looked the same. And it did. It looked exactly like that. There were still umbrellas, still chairs, and just an example that, these penalties are kind of a drop in the bucket for these building owners. And finally, this is, I think, my favorite before and after, because we see in the before that there's this very innocuous ledge that you wouldn't expect people to use, but people are sitting there, they're eating their lunch there, it's a sunny spot, and then 1 year later, there's spikes over there, and of course, nobody is sitting there anymore. And I looked through Street View, and the spikes have been there every single year since 2017. Before we published, we did call all of these building owners to ask them if they had any comments about the violations. And this building owner, this next day that I called them, they filed a certificate of correction with the Department of Buildings. And when I visited the plaza a week later, the spikes were gone, which I think shows the tangible impact that stories like this can have on our environment. So that's all from me today. I just wanted to point you towards a couple of resources, and I can try to link these back in the event details after the talk. But that Google Maps layer that I was showing you in the beginning, I actually made that publicly available. So you can download it onto your own Google Maps app and explore these spaces. And then the 311 complaint form, if you Google, POPs 311 complaint, complaint form will pop up. And you can, if you see a problem with one of the spaces near you, please fill that out. This is how you bring inspectors to the site, and this is how violations are issued, and this whole system is enforced. And then if you have any other questions, you can contact me. This is my email. But yeah, Q&A. I would love to answer questions now.
Is this policy still active? Like buildings can still make this trade?
Yeah.
Have you ever been curious about or looked into how new buildings that are using taking advantage of this policy, how they're using it, and if they're being compliant for the most part?
Yeah, we were exploring kind of looking at a timeline of when these trades were made and whether newer buildings were complying more with the rules. And I think it is true that newer buildings are generally more compliant, and that's because in the years since this zoning resolution was passed, there have been more and more design requirements that have been introduced for these spaces. So as I mentioned, a lot of these earlier spaces weren't required to have seating. There were no design requirements in the beginning. But as spaces have been built, and a lot of these earlier spaces literally resemble driveways and are completely unusable, I think the city has been more conscious in adding adding amendments to that zoning resolution to require things like seating and greenery and signage. Signage is a big one, to have signs in all of these spaces that it is a public space. Yeah.
How does this policy come up against like buildings that purchase air rights?
Yeah, that's interesting. We didn't really look at air rights when we were doing this story, but I think, yeah, definitely worth looking into.
I'm wondering about the complaints data, if you were able to look at, for the complaints, like how long from when the complaint happened to when an inspection happened. If you were able to do that, and what like trends were, if you were.
Yeah, we did look into that, but it is hard to match up those data sets. So we can see when a complaint happened. We have the timestamp of that, but it's hard to tell when the subsequent inspection happened, whether it was because of a complaint or because it was a scheduled inspection. That distinction isn't like a column in a data set that we could pull. Yeah, good question.
First, thank you, Urvashi, for that fantastic presentation. I think the meticulous way that you talk about the fairness to which how you try to be mindful of the data collection to both sides, that was fantastic. So I did read an article when it first came out, and I know New York Times comment section is all pretty active, pretty vocal. I think according to you, were there any reception from people that you were surprised by, or maybe even any like buildings really contact you about your article? Like, I'm just curious to the extent that you can share any surprising reception.
Yeah, I think I was pleasantly surprised by the reception in the comments. People were very activated by the story, and a lot of people in the comments didn't know that these spaces exist, and the story kind of spread awareness about them. There was also a portion of people in the comments who were like, this has been a problem for so long. And that was also, good to hear that we were just like adding to this history of coverage about these sites and keeping this topic in conversation. Sorry, what was your follow-up question to that?
Oh, it was just like maybe did you get any angry emails
from
people? To the extent that you can share.
I was kind of worried about getting angry emails from building owners and developers, but fortunately I didn't receive any. I haven't received any yet.
Cool. Hi, thank you. My question is, well, first I'll start off by saying I'm from Seattle, and in Seattle there's a bunch of new development happening where in order to develop a building, particularly like apartment buildings, there are requirements for spaces kind of similar to POPs. Some of them are more like indoor public spaces, etc. And very similarly, there's a ton of them that are not following through in any of the ways they're originally intended to. So I guess my question is a little bit more theoretical, which is, do you think that this kind of policy making, these sorts of exchanges of public space for increased development could ever hope to actually sustain public spaces? Or are they kind of a lost cause, given that private developers are never going to adhere properly to like the agreements?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wasn't aware that there was a similar policy in Seattle, so I'm definitely going to look into that later. But I think the main issue here is that enforcement isn't baked into the initial law that was formed. So when the zoning resolution was created, there wasn't really any like enforcement process that was developed later. And also the agency that handles enforcement, Department of Buildings, is different from the agency that handles the approval of these agreements, which kind of creates a disconnect there. So I think if design requirements and enforcement were to kind of be considered at the very beginning of the process, then there is more hope.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I'm wondering, this is a subject I don't know anything about, but I know with certain key subway stations, there are privately managed like entrances to the station. I'd imagine that's a separate program because it would involve coordination with the MTA. I'm wondering if like you look into that program at all, like if that's something that's like there is better enforcement or better managing of that program.
Yeah, there are a couple of other programs that the city does kind of incentivize and give this bonus floor area out for, and I think subway improvements are one. There's also, there's some laws around landmark buildings that I haven't looked into in detail. Also affordable housing. And I think we had initially decided to kind of add that as part of the conclusion of the story to kind of branch out a little bit, but in the end, kind of felt like it distracted from this part of the story.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I've gotten a little bit more curious about this because I have used POPs before. Like I have seen these public spaces and I have enjoyed them and appreciated them. But recently, I work at NYU and I've noticed that on the Manhattan campus, NYU owns buildings that have public spaces, but they have restricted access to those spaces due to student activism. So I wonder if you, like, in the data that you looked at, have you noticed any patterns where there were more violations given during, like, let's say a political event or like around the protests or something like that, or like the spikes, like that usage also is an obvious deterrent for unhoused people.
Yep.
So I wonder if you saw anything where there were obvious or subtle ways to discourage the use of these spaces.
Yeah, I think the final example that I showed here, this addition of spikes, is something that just anecdotally I saw a lot when I was conducting my site visits, and this is definitely to discourage people from sleeping there at night and laying down on those benches. I haven't looked into history of protests and kind of matching up those timelines, but one thing I do want to point out is that during Occupy Wall Street, people did use Zuccotti Park as the site of their protests, and Zuccotti Park is one of these privately owned public spaces. But yeah, it's really interesting that NYU is, I would be interested in kind of looking at the POPs data set that the Department of City Planning has provided and see if any of those buildings that NYU owns are in there, and then to kind of see whether those spaces are supposed to be public, why have they restricted access. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just add, I only know anecdotally about this. I haven't personally looked into it. But I think it's a building that students have identified where the indoor lobby is supposed to be a public space. So there's more room to exercise control because it's not like an outdoor park.
Yep. Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I would also be curious to see if it's in that data set.
Yeah, and I just that reminds me, a lot of the indoor spaces here are, I think, even harder to access. Trump Tower is a great example. Trump Tower contains, I think, 3 or 4 of these privately owned public spaces. 2 of them are upstairs, so you actually have to take an elevator to go up. I visited Trump Tower 3 times, and I was never allowed to use the elevator to go up. The guards there gave me like a variety of reasons, that there was, construction happening, electrical problems. Yeah, I was never able to visit those. And I think that the indoor spaces are, there's definitely, it's more hostile to enter.
Thank you for using our data. I work at DCT. The story's been on my desk since it was printed. And I'm wondering about the enforcement stuff though. So can DOB change the frequency or amount of fines at any time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before 2017, the DOB did not have scheduled inspections of these sites. The only way for an inspector to go to one of these sites was through a public complaint. And then I think there was a local law that was passed in 2017 that requires once in 3-year proactive inspections of these sites, because people were realizing that there also has to be some proactive element here. You can't just be reactive based on complaints that you're receiving. So I know that they did make that change to change the frequency of visits. I don't know if penalties have changed much since the enforcement process starts. yeah, I'm not sure about that part.
My question was actually similar to the penalties. Like, did you see any like trends of the buildings owners who would just keep paying the penalty even if they were like repeated violators?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason that we chose this building to feature in the intro was because it had, a series of violations in recent years. So every year they would keep the plaza closed, but just, pay another $5,000. And again, like I mentioned, that restaurant that has been privatizing that plaza, they've been issued a violation for that infraction and, are still there despite having paid the penalty, because I'm not really sure what their reasons are. It could be that the outdoor dining space is more lucrative than the penalty, so it's worth just paying the penalty to kind of stay there. Yeah, but definitely, I don't think the penalties are enough of a deterrent. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask just a little bit about your process. I think I came here thinking like the New York Times, they work on these deadlines and must work through these projects really quickly. So, that's been maybe discouraged to know that it takes still so long for a great project like this. But I'm wondering how you or your editors sort of decide that you have enough to run with the story, and when you think you need to keep either getting other data to look at or keep them on.
Yeah. So just one note about like the longer time frame of this story is that I think it's less newsy compared to other stories that the Times puts out. It's definitely not, covering a daily news kind of situation or breaking news situation. So I had more leeway with the timeline there. I could kind of like keep it on the back burner for a few months while waiting for DCP to get back to me with the FOIL request, or there could be a couple of weeks where I was working on something else and then came back to this. So that's why it took as long as it did. But I think also to answer, like, at what point do we have enough data to just stop reporting and to start arranging? I think we just needed to be at a point where we had like it wasn't just anecdotal, references to problems. When we had that violations data set, for example, we were like, okay, this is enough to ground our observations in real data. And so that's kind of when we stopped looking into that. When we got the FOIL data from DCP and parsed that into a sheet, we had that data collected. So yeah, I think another thing that I kind of ran up against was when to stop interviewing people. I interviewed a lot of people for this story. A lot of architects of these plazas, building owners, developers, and obviously we couldn't use all of their quotes in the story. So for my next story, I have learned that lesson.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I remember reading this story in the paper, so
oh, yay.
The interactive graphics. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the collaboration process with the designers who worked on the piece, and like at what point did they come in, and how did they like contribute to maybe the research or the reporting?
Yeah. So up until when I had finished my site visits, this was kind of a personal project that I hadn't talked to anyone in the newsroom about. When I pitched it with Denise Liu, who is a great graphics reporter at the Times, and that's when we started collaborating, and we started doing some of that initial like finding real life data sets to match up my observations to. And then later, Keith Collins came onto the story and helped me kind of develop the visuals for it at the end. So I think involvement from collaborators came towards like the reporting and arranging segments of the story and the leading up to that, I was kind of just like visiting these sites and figuring out if there was even anything there to report on.
Hey, again, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering what the evolution of ops is moving forward, because I think some of these issues seem to be, you're able to anticipate some of them. So for example, renting out space to a restaurant and then the restaurant uses it in perpetuity. So like moving forward, are there provisions, just like amenities, for how owners are allowed to use these spaces, for example, or like just future-proofing it as problems arise?
Mm-hmm. I feel like the only way to do that is to bolster the enforcement process even more and maybe hike up the penalties so that they aren't just a drop in the bucket for developers. There are already design requirements in place. So spaces that are being built now have to have, a certain number of chairs. They have to be open within a certain time window every day. So I think that's in a good place. I think enforcement needs to match up to that now. And did I miss part of your question or? Okay. Yeah. A couple of the newer sites that I visited, there's one at 550 Madison. That's an indoor atrium, and it's beautiful. Those have just been really great to see. So I'm optimistic, but I do think that enforcement needs to be heightened.
Thank you. I work for parks, so I also, the management side of it is a pain, especially on the waterfront access plans. It's a similar arrangement where we struggle with the maintenance of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if with the mayor's office of public realm and different bids in the city and other kind of third-party management
Mm-hmm.
entities, did they have any take on this, or did you talk to them in the process?
I think the public realm czar was appointed towards the end of our reporting process, so we didn't talk to them. We did talk a lot with DCP and DOB, and yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything on the agenda in terms of the public realm czar's actions towards these spaces. Do you know of anything?
I don't know of anything, but I know that a lot of Union Square bid and Madison Park bid, I think a lot of them take on maintenance responsibilities for public spaces. So I'm just curious if that exists for privately owned spaces as well. If they kind of come to a deal with the developer, or if it's just worth the developer.
Yeah.
Penalty.
Is the DOB involved in parks enforcement at all, or?
Yeah, so I can tell you guys. So on the park side, we have our own kind of inspection agency that inspects all of our green spaces. I'm part of the grant. A handful of people are doing it all of us every day. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of on the graphics side, I was wondering, because the product that ends up coming out of these processes is usually one report, one story, impactful, and I'm curious if there's interest to use the graphics team to create things that are updated with the same premise, but perhaps new data so that people can see what's happened since with particular sites. Is that something that exists for other stories that might be of interest here?
Oh, like a continually updating kind of story. Yeah. I think for this story, it's possible we could kind of keep it on a 1 month republish thing, but then I think we would just have to keep fact checking all the data out there every month, and it would turn into not an entirely automatic process. We do have stories like that out there, for example, the COVID tracker pages that we had during the pandemic. Those would auto-update as new data came in for years and years. So we do have templates for that. I don't know if the story felt too labor intensive and manual to kind of put on an automatic publish thing like that. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. First off, I just want to address, I have heard the public realm person speak a little bit about this, or like their office. So I think it is kind of on the radar of like several folks around. And then my question was, I'm wondering a little bit about, so talking about the enforcement piece here and the idea of like what it would look like if there was a better enforcement. And I think the question that comes to mind for me is like, as you were talking to folks, as you were exploring these spaces, even the ones that totally adhere to like the things they're supposed to be doing, as public spaces, like are very, very different than a park. I think are more and less welcoming to different people. Sometimes they have private security. Sometimes they're sort of, I think, geared towards like maybe folks who are like having lunch while they're at work, but not super welcoming to families. And kind of maybe even furthermore, in certain contexts, like, to bring up Seattle again, Amazon has a lot of really massive public space in the city, and it definitely increases their public image in the city and gives them kind of credit for being a facilitator of public space that is not necessarily earned. So I guess I'm wondering, in your opinion, if there are new things you would add to the enforcement list, should the other things kind of get addressed, that might make these spaces a little bit more viable as public space.
I think the law that mandates signage in all of these spaces is really important. I think a lot of these spaces, as you mentioned, are under surveillance, have gates. Like this plaza, for example, it has a gate in front of it. And just an addition like that, which is seemingly kind of harmless, actually creates another barrier of entry for these sites. So I think thinking about small things like that, like cameras, gates, how people can, like entry points into the space, I guess, how open they are is important.
I was also wondering if the purview of the storing was limited to Manhattan, or was it the other boroughs too? Because in the map, I think I noticed like Brooklyn were pretty sparse as compared to like Midtown.
Yeah.
Is that just I've been wondering if it's the story or if it's the publicly owned public spaces that mostly builders are usually end up being in Manhattan versus the other boroughs?
Yeah, definitely they are most densely concentrated in Manhattan. They do exist across all boroughs, but we, for a lack of real estate on our page, had to kind of narrow it down to zoom in on the denser part of these spaces, which happened to be Manhattan. And also the examples that we picked out were in Midtown regions specifically, just to make them more relatable. And also, those parts of the city receive the most footfall, and so that's why we picked them out. But yeah, there are examples of violations across the board, not just in Manhattan. Another reason I think these spaces are most dense in Manhattan, new construction is one of them, but also just like real estate is at such a premium in Manhattan that having that bonus floor area as an incentive to build these spaces becomes much more appealing to developers.
I wonder then, kind of related to that question, I don't know the answer, but is it fair to say that there might also be more of these spaces in Manhattan because there are more privately owned buildings, or is that kind of like a stretch too far?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that can follow from that. Yeah, I have to think about that one, but yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just like a question because I think like Midtown, especially as Times Square, like these huge tourist destinations.
Right.
Compared to Queens, which might be a lot more residential.
Yeah. Actually, a lot of these buildings with privately owned public spaces are a mix of commercial and residential. So a lot of residential buildings in Manhattan also have public plazas attached to them. But I think it's also just that floor area is capped so rigorously in Manhattan, and is so valuable to developers.
So maybe it might be more accurate to say it's primarily taller buildings.
Yeah.
Like a 4-story building wouldn't necessarily apply when it comes to like the POPs exemption or like benefit, for example.
Okay, well, I think that's everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions or ideas or anything to riff on. Thank you.